Welcome, everybody, to the Truthful Hope Podcast. I'm your host, Jacob Vazquez. For 5 decades, over 62 million human beings were intentionally killed legally in the United States. This is 10 times the number of Holocaust victims, and equivalent to filling Yankee Stadium 1,143 times over. More precisely, at least 63,459,781 innocent human beings have been legally killed in the U.S. since January 22nd, 1973. That's 3,548 deaths per day and is equivalent to the death count of the horrific 9/11 terrorist attack if it had happened over 21,316 days. Despite one's religion, preferred political party, race, gender, everybody should be grieved by these numbers. That is until it's disclosed that these numbers represent unborn human beings aborted in the womb. And it's at that point that you become unfazed, or maybe you feel misled that these numbers represented actual human beings. Abortion is a tense topic, but one that is tremendously important. For if the unborn are valuable human beings, then abortion is not only the leading cause of death by far, but it's the most horrific atrocity that humanity has ever faced. So here to join me to talk about abortion is stand to reason apologist Megan Almon. Megan, thank you so much for joining today.
It's an honor to be with you, Jacob.
Yeah, it really is. I want to, it's funny how we connected, and I'll tell our listeners how we did afterwards, but I want to first just go through your background. I want to share with them what I found online, and maybe you could comment on anything extra that I missed.
Okay.
But Megan worked as an award-winning journalist until 2008, when she decided to pursue a career speaking and teaching about Christian apologetics, especially in the area of pro-life apologetics, bioethics, and aesthetics. She joined the Life Training Institute in 2009 and was awarded an MA in Christian apologetics from Biola University in 2011. She worked with Scott Klusendorf at Life Training Institute until 2024, when she began working with the speaking team at Apologetics, Inc. And then in 2025, she started a new chapter at our beloved ministry, Stand to Reason, with her husband, Tripp, who is also the Stand to Reason Outpost Coordinator. And Megan has trained tens of thousands of people on the pro-life view. She has a unique perspective as a wife, mother, a teacher, and an athlete, being part of the 2002 SEC Championship Women's Gymnastics team at the University of Georgia. That is a mouthful, but please include anything I may have missed there.
Well, I don't even know what else to include. You kind of hit it all. I think that the turn into pro-life apologetics was all Scott Klusendorf's fault. I'll say that. I blame him entirely. The story of how I got into this work, because I'm often asked, came about because I was a journalist. My whole background was in art. So I finished with a journalism degree at the University of Georgia, but I started as an art major. So my whole background was stories and portraits and people. People was always the common denominator, and they still interest me now. I went to cover an event that I was not supposed to go and cover. The girl who was supposed to go and cover the event that evening went on a date. And so I remember very clearly my editor coming out of the office and saying, "Megan, I need you to go cover this event. Take a camera. There's free food." And I had to call my husband, Tripp, and say, "I'm going to be late getting home." The event was our local pregnancy resource center banquet. Most pregnancy resource centers raise the money that they use for their work for the year through donations, largely contributed at an annual fundraiser like this. And so I went, and Scott Klusendorf was the speaker that night. And what he had to say rocked my world. So to sum that part up, I left with 2 impressions. Number 1, I knew something about abortion now, more than I did before. And I knew that I had to do something. I was moved to action rather than just like a complacent pro-life position. I needed to do something to make a difference. The second thing that grabbed me about what Scott was doing, he was doing Christian apologetics, specifically pro-life apologetics, which is it's right at home in the Christian worldview. And he was talking about human dignity. Why do human beings matter? It was bigger questions that he was dealing with that answered the pro-life cause, but so much more. And I thought, those are the stories I have to be telling. I want to tell those stories. And I called him about a year and a half later after I had read everything I could get my hands on. And he finishes the story with others by saying, I bugged him until he hired me. That's what he tells people. That's fine with me. I was certainly persistent, but I wanted to learn what he had to teach, and he has been a wonderful and gracious teacher since. So that was the thing that made the switch, because people go, journalism to pro-life apologetics. What does that math look like?
Mm. Well, it's really funny because I have my bachelor's degree in journalism, and I told you before the recording. Now I'm in cancer research, but also doing pro-life apologetics. That's kind of how we got connected, actually. You know, I'm a stand to reason outpost director in Delaware. I think the only one in Delaware, so I'm going to stand by that. So me and Tripp, you know, we've talked on occasion. But recently, I did my thesis defense at Liberty University on the issue of abortion, actually talking about those larger issues that you mentioned, Scott talked about, like human dignity. You know, I spoke about pretty much, you know, pro-choicers will, and we'll talk about this in the conversation, but pro-choicers will ground personhood in self-awareness and consciousness and rationality and all these things. And my question is, well, which worldview explains those things? So that's really what my thesis is on. And Tripp and I had a back and forth, and then he mentioned you, and I was like, well, let's get her on the podcast because that's incredible. So here we are after all that. But it's really good to know that you used your journalism, or I want to say God used your journalism to bring you to this point. That was actually my first question for you, was how you got into pro-life apologetics, if you were always pro-life. So I guess that question still remains, were you always pro-life? But then what brought you to do apologetics with this view? Because it's one thing to stand for the unborn, right? But it's a whole other thing to go and publicly defend it as you have in front of thousands of people. That takes passion. So what really sparked that passion for you?
Well, let's start with your first question. Was I always pro-life? And the answer would be honestly, no, for a couple of reasons. One reason was I don't think I had a position on the issue for a long time because I never gave it any thought. It wasn't something that impacted me directly. I grew up in a very nominally Christian home, but it's not one where we were like discussing these issues. I was at a public high school. I just didn't run across it. And as a high level athlete, I was somewhat sheltered because I did gymnastics during those years. When I was 19 years old, I became a Christian in earnest. And what I say by that, what I mean by that is, I think I trusted Jesus as my Savior a long time before that, but I did not know how to trust him as my Lord. I did not understand that the Christian worldview touches everything. And so when I was 19 years old, that became a reality. I started to understand. I'm still learning, right? um, but when that happened, I had to look at these things differently. I think my family, for a long time, held I'm personally pro-life, but I don't think we should push that view on others. So it was a very much a morally relativistic view with regard to abortion. And so I just went along with that until I began to look at it in earnest and understand either abortion intentionally takes the lives of innocent human beings or it doesn't. And as far as the passion, those stories about what it means to be human and valuable hit my core so hard that my tuning fork is still going today. I have to talk about it. I have to talk about it because when I see people who have these larger questions, whether they vocalize them or not, about does my life have meaning? What is the purpose? What does it mean to be human? And the way that we see human beings interacting, the things that we argue over because we're passionate about them. The pro-life position is so much bigger and better and more beautiful as it is housed in that larger Christian worldview. The story that we have as Christians to tell other people about who they are and why they matter and whose they are. It's like giving the gift of freedom all the time. And if that can make a small dent in the abortion issue so that people are changed such that they begin acting to protect life. My friend Jay Watts, who's a wonderful pro-life apologist as well, runs a ministry called Merely Human Ministries. He said one time, this job, this public speaking, this teaching of other Christians, this or other pro-life advocates even, this is how I sleep at night. And so I think that's I've kind of taken that on as my own as well.
Wow, that's incredible. And I'm very similar in that regard because when you're a Christian and there's like baby food that you take in as a baby Christian, right? But then you start taking the hard stuff and you start seeing the world from a Christian perspective and things start changing. For me, it was having my children. When my daughter was born, it was great. Like I was overjoyed with so much excitement. But then immediately my mind went to like looking at the ultrasound. There are some people that look at that same image and think, I don't want it. I'm going to kill it. It broke me. Like it really broke me to a point where if there's anything I can contribute to the kingdom, I think it's this area here. Um, so it's just such when you see it firsthand. I know you have children, so I'm sure you see the same thing. It becomes more real, and less of just. It's definitely not a political issue. I think I try and tell as many people as possible. It is quite literally a matter of life or death, and that's what we're doing here. Now, you've been doing pro-life apologetics, from what I understand, since 2009, maybe 2008. Now we're just entering 2026, so that's about 20 something years, right? Have you seen the debate shift? In other words, in what ways, if at all, has the abortion debate changed since 2009?
I think that I've seen there have been subtle shifts because at the base of it, the basic arguments that we offer as a pro-life apologists, which we can cover or talk about, you've had other episodes where you've talked about these as well. Those don't change. The argument at core doesn't change. We frame the debate by asking that question, what is the unborn? We bring the best that science has to offer to show their humanity. And then we go to philosophy to ground their value as something that is intrinsic, just like yours and mine, not something that's based on performance. That doesn't change. What I have seen is a subtle shift in those years where perhaps earlier on, people had more questions about the science. And as the science has come more to the forefront, or as people have become more informed on the issue, at least at the academic level, the debate has largely shifted to the philosophy, to the value questions, which is what you're grappling with your thesis, with your writing. And so that shift has taken place. But for me, I still see it necessary to teach the science because there's still questions there. And at the street level, which is what I'm concerned with, the person standing in line next to me, the people sitting in the pews, my next door neighbor, my son's friends at school. Like these are the people who you want to still bring to bear the best evidence that we have to offer. That's been one subtle shift. Another shift has been in recent years with the overturn of Roe v. Wade. I think the pro-life movement is in an interesting place. I was actually just discussing this with a friend earlier today. About just the state of things. I think that for many, when Roe v. Wade was overturned just a couple of years ago, the consensus was, or the thought was, oh, abortion's going to go. That's the end of abortion. And it's never going to be the case. If anything, the overturn of Roe v. Wade was a small, necessary step in a much larger battle. So to your point, this is not just a political issue, but the law is a teacher. And we have a nation who, on the whole, has been told for 50 years that abortion is a legal right. And now they've been told, actually, it's up to your state to decide. The good part of this, in terms of what we do, is people have been given their voice back in that political arena so that when we cast a vote, it says something. When we convince our friends and neighbors and propose a pro-life view so that they might cast their votes as well, we can make a difference in that way. But I think that the pro-life movement at large took a hit because the thought of many who hadn't really done as much of the research as you and I have perhaps thought, oh, it's done. And it was nowhere close to done. In fact, the fight was just beginning in a different way. And so we find ourselves right now more than ever in need of having these conversations.
That's so good. And I really would love to touch on the scientific arguments and defenses and the philosophical as well with you today. But before we do that, Can you define for us pro-life apologetics? I mean, you're right. I've talked about this on the program before and apologetics at large, but maybe just for our listeners just tuning in, what is pro-life apologetics?
Apologetics is simply the art of offering reasons for something. And it was a crazy thing because we link it to that word apologize. In fact, true story, my dad, to this day, I'm not really sure if he was joking or not. When I told him I was going to go and study Christian apologetics for a master's program, he wanted to know what Christianity had to apologize for. It's offering reasons for something, making a reason defense. And so pro-life apologetics is offering reasons for why the pro-life view is true and valid. And I think it's a subset of the larger Christian apologetic because it fits so well. Christianity, the Imago Dei teaching in particular of Christianity, that human beings are made in the image of God, is the bedrock for the pro-life view. It grounds it all the way down. So pro-life apologetics is offering reasons for the pro-life view.
I love that you brought up the Imago Dei. That's really what my thesis, it's actually, I'm now in the process of converting it into a book after some, by the grace of God, some high praise on it. My committee was really pleased with it. But that's really what the bedrock is of my argument is the Imago Dei, because I'm arguing that the best explanation for these aspects of humanity that are deemed as morally relevant for personhood is that human beings are made in the image of God, not a naturalism perspective of Darwinian evolution or accidental byproducts. And I think it's massively important, especially, and this is kind of what sparked me to come up with this argument. As of late, I interviewed Greg Kokel, your boss technically, and we talked about abortion, and he was like, and as you've probably heard him say plenty of times, the most important question in the abortion debate is what is the unborn? And I posted the clip on social media of him, and you wouldn't believe how many comments were saying pretty much, so what? Who cares? Who cares if it's a human being? And then I started looking to the scholarly realm, and you got Judith Jarvis Thompson, David Boonin, Naomi Wolf at one point, all saying the same thing. Even if it's a human being, it still doesn't make it morally wrong to abort. I think we've arrived at this really critical place in culture of where the sanctity of life is overlooked to the point where it's with confidence, where it's like, we really don't care. So I think, as like you said, as pro-life apologists, it's much more than just the politics, the legality of abortion, but it's how do we view humanity as a whole? And that'll impact how we treat other people.
Yes, it will. And I think that's the key to what you're talking about. Francis Schaeffer called abortion a watershed issue, or even a capstone issue, right? The thing that holds the whole structure together, that if we don't get it right on this one, the whole structure of our culture will fall. If we do not understand what the most vulnerable among us are and why they matter, then how can we understand anything about who we are and why? There are logical consequences to accepting a view that says that we can do away with some human beings, but not others.
And we've tried it before. We've tried it before with the Holocaust. We've tried it with slavery. It didn't work. It's not going to work. So I'm really appreciative of your work, of Scott's work. Certainly. I mean, I used his book, The Case for Life, which I mentioned earlier,
to you
all before the report. Oh, perfect. That's great. I was going to go get it. Look at that. To our listeners, go buy that book. It is necessary. That is awesome.
Yes.
That was not planned, by the way. That is great. So I want to shift now. Let's dive into the science a little bit, because you brought it up. You said the science is fading away. I agree. And from my research, that's what I've seen as well. It's not as prominent. The lay person, the pro-choice lay people, I think they still bring it up. But once they hear a little bit of rebuttal, they go back to philosophical objections, which we'll get to. So, the pro-choicer, I've seen clips on social media where, let's say you have a pro-lifer with a sign with an unborn child being aborted, and the pro-choicer comes up and says, that's not a human being, that's a fetus, or that's a parasite or a clump of cells, right? I'm sure we've all seen these videos. Now, regardless of how it's phrased, they're discounting the humanity of the unborn.
Yes.
How would you make the case, briefly, now I know this could be extended into something larger, but how would you briefly make the case for the humanity of the unborn scientifically?
It's a fantastic question. And interesting that it would happen with people holding up signs of images of fetuses in the womb or unborn children in the womb, because we've gotten very good at a culture on many fronts of looking at what's right in front of us and pretending that it's not what it is. With the science of the unborn, first of all, when we ask that question, what is the unborn? Many don't recognize that it is a scientific question and not a religious question, right? Some people think, well, that's a religious issue. You Christians, you're this. But in fact, the pro-life view is held not just by Christians, but by many different people of many different worldviews or persuasions. There are pro-life feminists. There are pro-life atheists. There are pro-life Wiccans. There are pro-life Buddhists, like you name it. And you've got the same arguments that you and I are making. With the science of the unborn, we look at embryology, which is the specific branch of science that has to do with the study of embryos. Like there's whole textbooks dedicated to that question.
I got one of them back there.
I'm going to say, I do too.
Yeah.
The latest one might be Layman's. I'm not sure, but it's on the shelf in the other room.
Yeah.
And they pretty much say the same thing, all of them. And they have for the better part of maybe 4.5 decades now. That particular branch of science has said that from the moment of conception, you and I, Jacob, you and I, listener, we were living, distinct, whole human beings. And I like to break down those categories, and we can do that quickly because it matters. The unborn, from that initial stage, are alive. We know that because they do the things that organisms do. Like that's like 7th grade life science, right? You check all the boxes of what constitutes an organism. Well, it undergoes cellular reproduction, meaning it grows. That is the perceived problem, right? Something's growing. It metabolizes by turning food into energy, responds to stimulus. So when you mess with it, it will do things. In lab studies, embryos have even been shown to be very good at repairing wounds. So if you make like a nick on just like we get a scratch on our arm, our body works to repair that area. The embryo can do that too if the damage is not too significant. It's definitely alive. Scientifically, it's also distinct, meaning that it is not part of the woman's body. That's common kind of language that's thrown around a lot, but it's not. Not like my arm is attached to our mothers at one point in time. Every single one of us, but we were not genetic code. And it differed from our mothers and from our fathers. And that's why I think you'll hear many say things like the unborn has its own blood type. It has its own organ systems. It has its own gender. Like all of these things are true because it is a distinct entity. And if you'll allow me to, Jacob, I just want to nerd out for a minute and give credit to the wonderful Dr. Maureen Kondik, who is a neurobiologist. She's amazing. Great Catholic thinker, but she is a scientist by trade. She works at the University of Utah, last I checked. And I'm going to do my best to present her words accurately. She's often asked as a scientist, if cell becomes another type of cell. And her answer is easy. Across the board in biology, if one cell changes in the stuff it's made up of, its material composition, then you have a new cell, scientifically speaking. Or if the cell changes the way it behaves, then you have a new cell. So there are two indicators that only one of those things has to happen, she says. Kondik, who is pro-life, is asked the question, can we know when human life begins? And she answers, yes. The moment that sperm and egg meet, within about 215 milliseconds, the plasma membranes of those two cells begin to merge to form a hybrid cell surface. So that egg cell changes in its material composition about like as quick as I could snap my fingers, and you have a new cell by definition. It goes from being an egg cell that could have survived about 24 hours in its environment to being a new thing that can survive. You tell me, my grandpa just turned 101 in June.
Wow. Because
it's a brand new human being. Just remarkable. It meets the second qualifier too within about 3 to 5 minutes after that initial fertilization takes place, because it forms that zona pellucida. So the egg cell starts repelling sperm instead of trying to attract them. So it changes its behavior. But Scientifically speaking, we have a distinct entity and it happens that fast. The unborn is a whole human being. Like WHOLE, that's a crazy thought to think that this single cell is a whole human being. But everything that makes you you was already there at that stage of your development. You weren't part of a larger organism. Often, as a scientific objection, I'll get asked the question, and maybe you have too. Well, but sperm cells and egg cells, they're alive, but they're not human beings. So what's the difference between those cells and that single-celled embryo or that zygote? And the difference is that instead of being a part of a larger organism with a specific role to perform with regard to the function of that organism, the embryo's parts work toward its overall function, and it goes on to do remarkable things. And the difference, we often talk about the difference between something that is constructed and what the embryo does. I think that we think about embryos as constructed things because I hear that language that you brought up a minute ago. Oh, it's just a clump of cells. Oh, it's just a mass of tissue, nothing more. It's not alive. It's not a human. As if it's a process by which you start with a clump of cells and add more parts, like something on an assembly line, and then the end product is the baby. But the embryo does something that no constructed thing could ever do. You and I drove our own development from within. And we're still doing that right now. So the science is clear. It is a living, distinct, and whole human being. And we could go on and on, but I'll stop.
Hey everyone, just wanted to pause here for a minute and thank you for listening to the Truthful Hope Podcast. We hope you've been enjoying the episode so far. To help us with our mission of sharing the hope of Christianity with as many people as possible, please consider subscribing to our podcast and leaving your thoughts and questions in the comments. You could find us on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. Furthermore, if you'd like to make a monetary contribution, please consider donating at truthfulhope.com/donate. As a 501c3 nonprofit, your donation may be tax deductible and you'll receive a receipt for your records. Thanks again, and now back to the show. That is probably one of the best ways I've heard it phrased scientifically, breaking down distinct, whole, living human being. I've read, some of Greg's work, and he brings up the law of biogenesis, which I thought is just so straightforward. And it's, you reproduce based on your kind or your species. And really, the equation is simple. Human mother plus human father equals human child. Always. It's never not the case. To believe otherwise is, in the words of Frank Turek, it takes more faith to believe that than anything else, right? Now, in my research for my thesis/book, I found this really incredible quote from a scientific paper. And it's a survey that was done recently in 2021 following the results of the consensus view about when life begins among biologists. And here's what it says. I'll quote from it. It says, since a recent study suggested that 80% of Americans view biologists as the group most qualified to determine when a human life begins, experts in biology were surveyed to provide a new perspective to the literature on experts' views on this matter. Biologists from 1,058 academic institutions around the world assessed survey items on when a human life begins. Overall, 96%, that's 5,337 out of 5,577, affirm the fertilization view. You really can't get closer to a universal acceptance of a view other than that.
Right.
So if we're going to trust the science, we ought to actually trust the science. It's plainly simple.
I'll say this because I think this happens often now because of exactly what you were talking about that you're running into with people going, I don't care that it's human, right? I think what happens many times for those listening, if you're in these conversations, is when somebody says, nobody agrees on when life begins. They're probably using the word life, not in the scientific sense, but in another sense, kind of like the Lion King, circle of life. Sing the song.
Great analogy. Well, that's a perfect segue to the next question, because now, like you said, they'll either switch to a philosophical view, right? Or the whole time they meant a life being something different than scientifically. So how did they mean it? They must have meant it philosophically. So they might say something like, okay, well, a human being is not the same as a human person, right? They might say something like that. And that's what the pro-choice philosophers say as well. Like Peter Singer, I'm sure you've dug into his work, as many have. He's a pro-choice philosopher and a pro-infanticide philosopher, meaning the advocating for the death of infants. And he openly admits the biological humanity of the unborn, as many other philosophers do. But he goes on to say a person is a being who is capable of anticipating the future, of having wants and desires for the future. So the difference for him between a human being biologically and a human person with value and worthy of protection is this self-awareness over time. And this is where other pro-choice philosophers, because they all kind of disagree on the exact requirements, list arbitrary requirements that the unborn don't possess. So before going into some of these requirements, what do you make of this view of personhood in general?
Well, I think it's interesting that we would make that separation at all, right? That you can have a human but not a person. Because the only way you can hold that view is if you accept the underlying idea or the logical link between those things that some human beings simply don't matter as much as other human beings. That's the idea that lurks beneath this distinction. And as you very eloquently pointed out before, this is not a new idea. This has been one that has been around for a long time. We can look as far back as, Israel in slavery under Pharaoh, and the numerous examples of slavery since that point in time up to current day sex trafficking and human trafficking, which people care deeply about, and rightly so. They are opposed to it. We can look at any instance of genocide. We can look at wars fought over things like racism or ethnic differences or whatever it is. These are all examples of some human beings simply don't matter as much as others and can either be harmed or outright disposed of. So I want to make the point that if you're going to adopt the idea of abortion being okay, given the best that science has to offer, if you're going to say it might be human, I agree with the science, but it's not a person, then you've got to adopt the notion that these other atrocities, they were linked to the very same idea.
It's such a good point. And it has implications, right? It's something
Yes.
that you can't avoid, like the infanticide. It's, Singer's requirement is, at least we think, is not available for the infant. They can't have this self-awareness over time. Again, we think.
It proves too much. And
It
Singer,
proves too much.
to his credit, is at least consistent. I don't, it's not funny, but he's consistent in that he's okay with abortion. He believes the unborn are not human in his, or not persons of value in his view, but he knows that there is no difference between that unborn child in the womb and the born child out of the womb, given his qualifier that would make infanticide out of the question. So yeah, you've mentioned what he talks about, but
That's right. There's serious implications. And I think that's why it's so important that we know where to ground human value, as you said Scott Klusendorf was talking about back in 2009 or 8 when you were a journalist. It's a significant issue. Now, one of the most popular requirements that I see and hear, whether it's in comment sections, whatever it may be, from pro-choicers, the popular audience I'm speaking of, is that the unborn are not human persons until birth. Birth is this line where they cross into value. What is your response to this common objection?
well, the first question, anytime somebody names the difference, right, between a human being and a valuable person or a rights-bearing person, whatever language they use to make the distinction, your job is to ask them, what is the difference? This individual that we're talking about has said birth. That's the line. My next question is, why is it birth and not some other point of that child's development? What's so value-giving about birth? Because what happens at birth, there is a disconnection from the mother, so to speak. But birth can happen very early, as we see with premature children who can't survive without medical assistance. So viability is another reason people often give. But the thing that happens mainly is a change of location. That child, that human being, moves somewhere between around 10 inches or less. That's about the length of the birth canal. So what is it about a change of location that brings this human being into valuable humanity? And then I would have the other person answer. And then I would go from there, because I don't know yet what they would
Yeah.
say.
Right. It's funny because, well, it's not funny, but in my book, thesis, whatever, I mentioned my neighbor who's a good friend of ours, and she had her baby at 16, 17 years old. Her baby was delivered at 21 weeks. And I think that's like tied with the earliest from a different case. She didn't
That's
get the fame,
remarkable.
unfortunately, but she had the 21 weeks delivery. And in my thesis and book, I kind of play this out. I'm like, so in this hospital, imagine there's the room where she's delivering this 21-week-old child. And then maybe 2 rooms down, you have a same age, 21 weeks gestation, being aborted because they're unwanted. What is the moral significance between those two, or difference between those two? I would say none, other than one is wanted and one is not wanted. But we don't kill people based on if they're wanted. So it's a serious problem. So birth is kind of like this wishful thinking, this magical idea that once they come through the birth canal, they're a valuable human person. It's just doesn't work, right? Cannot work. Now, I want to go back to Singer's requirement because it is important. The self-awareness over time is the requirement for personhood. Now, again, he uses this not only for killing unborn babies, but also for infanticide, who likewise don't possess this ability. How would you respond to that objection? It's a little bit of a deeper philosophical objection. But what would you say in response, even if it's as brief as a question?
Right. Well, the teaching tool that we use is an acronym called SLED. When we talk about the difference between the unborn and those of us who are not in the womb. Stephen Schwartz coined SLED years ago, the philosopher, and Scott modified it a bit. But basically, it says that there is no morally relevant difference, as you just pointed out, between the unborn and us that would justify having killed us back then, but not now. And the differences Schwartz named are differences of size, level of development, environment, which is the birth question, a change of location, and degree of dependency. These are the differences you can point out. I think that Singer's argument, in one sense, falls under the L in SLED. It is a level of development argument. And the argument goes, well, just because this one's at this level of development, it's past that qualifying line that Singer has named. Therefore, those who haven't have fallen out of human value. Now, as we pointed out, Singer is consistent in that it crosses over from not just the unborn who are disqualified from valuable humanity when he names that particular kind of self-awareness, but also the born. Up until around 28 days is his argument. Because those infants, those newborn infants, have not yet developed at least minimal self-awareness in order to desire for the future. I think he's really interested in their ability to gain pleasure or avoid pain, and it has to do with his ethical system. That they are disqualified as well. Whenever somebody like Singer names that difference, same rules apply as a moment ago. First question is, now that you've given me the difference between humans and persons, according to your view, what is so value-giving about self-awareness? This particular kind of self-awareness. Why is it this and not some other trait that grants the human being value? I don't know that he ever really gives a solid answer to that. But after that, it's the question that comes after that grounding question, why is it this and not something else, might be, who gets to determine that? Is that just your view? Like by what authority do we discount whole classes of humans based on their lack of this trait? As we're thinking through this, it's important for us also to ask ourselves, given that self-awareness as he defined it is the value-giving trait, what other humans are disqualified? Because we already talked about the fact that it proves too much. So it doesn't just disqualify the unborn and newborns from valuable humanity. It disqualifies whole other classes of humans. Alzheimer's patients, in the late stages of the disease are not self-aware in the way that he defines. Dr. Singer lost his mother to Alzheimer's disease, which was tragic. People in a coma are not self-aware. You could even make the argument that self-awareness comes and goes within the individual according to how much caffeine you've had. I mean, it's people who are sleeping are not self-aware. So there are so many different things that are problematic as we walk this out logically that we see. So are all these other human beings, did they not count either? How does this work out? The problem is there's no consistency to it.
Right. You brought up a really good point. What is the authority? Who is the authority? Because that really matters as to, when we look back in history, Holocaust, Hitler was the authority, the Nazi regime was the authority. But does that make it right? That seems problematic in that one group of people determined that a group of human beings were no longer worthy of life. I think it was quoted from some German philosophers back in that time, life unworthy of life. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing with the unborn today, is that the pro-choice movement is saying that is life unworthy of life. And that's a serious problem. And I think Singer runs into the same issues that you mentioned.
Yes. And just to be clear, because I talked about the fact that Singer was consistent, he was consistent in that he carried over from the unborn to newborns, but inconsistent in that there are whole other classes of humanity that it cancels out, which is what happens when we start naming traits, attributes, abilities, functions as the value-giving thing. Mm-hmm.
And that's what I love most about the pro-life apologetics movement here, like with Klusendorf and Beckwith in their books, Defending Life and the Case for Life, is they raise these counterfactuals, counterexamples of, okay, well, if you think this is the requirement for life, then you clearly have to wrestle with this example where this is obviously a person, but you're excluding them based on your requirement. And it's fair to do that. So for the listeners listening, Christian listeners who want to get into these conversations more, I recommend reading that book, The Case for Life, because it's incredible, but it has a host of these examples that you can raise to your pro-choice friends and family who may have never thought about this before. And I think it's key that we bring these out. Now, we talked about the personhood value, the view of personhood from the pro-choice view, which is personhood is rooted in what you can do. But what about the pro-life movement? What is the pro-life view of personhood? Where does one ground human value?
Yeah, well, it's because it's a philosophical question, right? It gives us these two ways of kind of answering. One answer we've already covered, and that is the answer that value is based on our performance. Sometimes this is called the functional value view or the instrumental value view. You're valuable because of something you can do. But the other way of looking at it is so simple. Most people overlook it or reject it. It's that we are intrinsically valuable, which simply means you're valuable in light of the kind of thing you are. Full stop. The pro-life view holds firmly to intrinsic value being the answer. You matter because you're human. It is the only answer that provides any consistency or any kind of equality, which is a word people really do care about. Equality is a big buzzword these days. And that's the only thing that makes sense, because those values those functions, those performance things come to each of us in varying degrees. They're things that we possess because we're human, but we don't possess them in equal measure all the time. And that's all right. That's why we have this beautiful diversity amongst our human family and in the kingdom of God even. The intrinsic view says the thing that doesn't come in degrees is the human nature that we all share. It only makes sense to ground value there. Any other answer, and you get societies where some human beings don't matter as much as others.
Right. You root it in what you are, not what you can do. It's just that's how the founders of America thought when they came up with the Declaration of Independence. It's what our whole system is rooted in, is this substance view, right? We're rooting it in the substance, the essence, or the nature of what we are. Now, I think it's necessary to talk about this, given how much it comes up, that we discuss one of the more pressing, if not the most pressing objections from pro-choicers, and that is, what about instances of rape? right? I once watched Joe Rogan. It was a clip, so I don't know if it was from many years ago or recently, but he must have been talking to someone who brought up abortion. Maybe he was pro-life, and he was very angry. And he said, you're telling me, you're going to sit there and tell me that my 12-year-old who got raped has to be forced to carry out this pregnancy, and said a whole bunch of curse words after that. I don't know if it was his real child, but just as an example, nonetheless, because it is real, this does happen, unfortunately, and it's super tragic. But for someone who raises this, how would you respond to this emotionally packaged example or objection?
Yeah. The first thing I would respond to is the emotion. People who have this question 9 times out of 10, and it's completely fair that they hold it. They want to know, what about this? This is so hard. It is unthinkable. How do we deal with this? And so I think the important thing to do in response is to recognize, yeah, this is hard. There's no like sugarcoating it or, oh, that's okay. Let's just jump over into intellectualism and solve all the problems. Most people who have this objection have it from the heart and not the head. And I get that. Sorry, questions like this bring faces to mind, right? So real stories, real people. Because the idea is that the one thing about apologetics that I really love is that it allows us to think about these difficult things in an abstract way. But the thing we can't ever forget is that those ideas are attached to real people. So with the rape objection, now that we've talked about the emotion of it, let's go up to that abstract. It's like following a kite string and see, how does this play out? If the unborn are human, and as science indicates, and if they are valuable, just like you and me, as philosophy indicates, grounded all the way down to theology, that Imago Dei view, then I can think about other human beings who might be in a similar circumstance. So for example, what would I do if I had a 2-year-old standing next to me, human and valuable, who was the product of rape? What if, for the sake of the argument, this 2-year-old reminded his mother every day of the event? Could she kill him in order to make herself feel better? Would it? In a civil society, how should we treat other human beings who remind us of terrible things? That's a bigger question to have to grapple with. And just as I think we would not kill the toddler, we cannot kill the unborn child either. I think that in instances of rape, though it is that simple morally, with regard to the question of abortion, let me be very clear about that. Because psychologically, in other ways, we know that it's not simple. This is one of those instances that because of the evil done to someone else, normal options are among the many things taken from them in the doing of the evil. For a woman who is assaulted, who conceives from that, which is rare, but it does happen, she's had many things taken from her, and among them is a normal option with regard to what to do next with this pregnancy. She has 2 options. One of them is the intentional killing of an innocent human being. That's what abortion is defined as, the intentional killing of a human embryo or fetus. That option is morally impermissible. All she has left is the option to carry the child to term. It's not fair. She didn't ask for it. And we can all agree this is not the way that it's supposed to be. The only difference is, so to Joe Rogan's pushback in that situation, where he's saying, you're saying that I should, that this, that. Actually, what you're saying as a pro-life advocate is, I recognize all the things you recognize. Nothing about this is okay. This is not the way it should be. Christianity even gives me the depth and width and breadth to call it evil. I'm just saying that the way we move forward cannot be to intentionally kill an innocent human being. There has to be a different way. If it helps to know this, I've met many, many women and men who have walked this particular road in the years of ministry. I've never met a woman who, having been raped and conceived and chosen life for the child, regretted doing so. I might meet someone one day who tells me, oh, I had the abortion and I'm glad I did. If that's the case, it won't change the argument, because how we feel about a thing doesn't determine what it is. It also might be interesting to know, I've never met someone who was raped, carried the child to term, and chose to raise that child as their own, who would tell me that the child reminded them of the event. No, this is my son and my daughter, right? So this is a different individual, is normally the response. Sometimes it's a chuckle, like, no. So that needs to be said, because that's contrary to the popular narrative. I think that there's a lie that's perpetrated out there that says, if that woman is just allowed to have the abortion will undo what was done to her. And that's a lie. So the pro-life answer the pro-life position has an answer for this. It's not easy, and it should never be brushed aside as easy. But I think it's the only way to go.
I love that you framed, address it emotionally first, show compassion. It's kind of like the problem of evil, right? And for some of our listeners, we talked about this. There's the emotional problem of evil and then the intellectual problem. But if someone raises evil and you just go right off of the intellectual, you're going to come off as hard and hard-hearted and not compassionate. They have really little reason to listen to you. You could, at the very least, because we all experience evil, you could say, yeah, that is hard. That is pretty tragic. And then you could get into some of the reasons. And I think with this rape case, and I say this in the thesis and book as well, we have to make sure that we don't jump to intellectual answers before showing the compassion, because it's such a big objection. And there are people like you, and people, you said you know faces that have battled this personally. So it's huge.
Yeah, it's messy. The reality of it, when we have the ideas meet our broken world, it's just messy. And I think that, it's going to sound cliche, but it is absolutely not. I don't know how to do what we do without the reality of the Christian story of reality, the true story of reality. I think that because our hope is in a fixed reality of the resurrection of Jesus, we know what's on the other side. We know that death has been defeated. I think that's the only thing that allows Christians uniquely to walk into the hard situations with their eyes wide open. So for those out there who are in these conversations or know people or whatever it is, it's messy, but it's like Martin Luther, right? I know what's true with regard to this issue, so I don't know where else to stand.
That is really good. Be great to end it there, but I have two more questions that I have to ask you. That was a powerful.
That's okay.
That was a powerful remark. But these two questions are brief. It's let's say a pro-choicer is listening. Let's picture a pro-choicer listening here, and as brief concluding remarks, what would you say to them to hopefully get them thinking about abortion differently? But what would be some brief remarks you would say to them?
I would say, first of all, kudos if you're listening. It takes great courage to listen to a viewpoint that's different than your own. And I would say just thank you. I would also challenge to wrestle with the ideas that have been presented today, just as Jacob and I are willing to wrestle with the ideas that are smartly presented by brilliant people who oppose us in our view. We should be reading them and representing the best version of the argument they have to offer. But I will say that at the end of the day, having done that up to this point, I have not found anything that is better than the pro-life view, as it is housed in the larger Christian worldview, like I said, but I've not found anything that explains what it means to be human and valuable better. It is a more beautiful story at the end of the day. Harder, inconvenient, but better.
That's so good. And then my last question is kind of counter to that. Let's say there's a pro-life apologist, a new pro-life apologist, a Christian who wants to start getting involved more. With the recent events of Charlie Kirk, more people are looking to get involved in these cultural issues. What would you say to this Christian who is just trying to get their feet wet and get into the game to help encourage them?
I'm saying, come on. I will say this. I am your biggest cheerleader, or at least one of them. There are people who have been doing this for a long time, and there are people who have knowledge, wisdom, and resources that they want to share. And if you are someone who thinks, well, I couldn't do something like that, or I couldn't talk about, yes, you can. But you're talking to a who knew that God would write my story the way that he did, and he did. And I can tell you that I would never have pictured myself standing in front of people talking about one of the most controversial issues of our age, with a willingness to know that there are people out there who absolutely despise what I have to say. But it's the belief and the knowledge and the understanding that what we have to say is better, that we are giving the gift of a better story of how we can do this life. Knowing that and resting in that and trusting the Lord to lead the way. Keep going. Keep going. And you will impact people in ways that Jacob and I can't.
So good. Now, Megan, where can our listeners, find more of your work? This has been such an awesome conversation, and I know our listeners are going to want to look for more. Where can we find more of your stuff?
Yeah. Well, Stand to Reason's website is str.org. It is, 32 years now, something like that, of materials that you can go back and learn. It's all there for you. So do that. Trip and I, both as part of the team at Stand to Reason, incredible team there, are going to be a part of 3 more reality student apologetics conferences this spring. One in Dallas, one in Philadelphia, and one in Los Angeles. So if you're anywhere near those conferences, there are still tickets available, and you can come and visit and hear about more incredible Christian apologetics material. And other than that, I just keep track of me at Stand to Reason, and I don't know what to say, Google, but that's a terrifying thing.
Stand to Reason is, I'm an avid supporter of Stand to Reason. I don't know of another apologetics ministry that has as much impact as Stand to Reason had, not only in like the people listening and watching, but even the fellow apologists and philosophers. It's like I was at ETS, which I don't know, were you at ETS this past year? Okay, I know I ran into the whole team except Trip, and I didn't know you were there, but I emailed him afterwards. I'm like, oh, I guess I missed you. But everyone I spoke to was like, and they knew of Stand to Reason, they knew of Greg Kokel, they knew of the work. And it seemed like Greg had everyone coming up to him every 2 seconds. So the work that's being done at Stand to Reason is just absolutely amazing. To our listeners, check them out. There's str.org, str.u, or stru.org, I think it is. There's Stand to Reason University. And Reality Conference, didn't you guys like sell out a few of them, almost all of them?
Yes.
Wow.
Speaking to the changes that we've seen with more people hungry to know, it has been a little bit overwhelming in the best way.
Yeah, wow. That is incredible. Well, Megan, I cannot thank you enough for coming on. Thank your husband as well for setting this all up. Trip is awesome. And I know he does great work on his own as well for the kingdom. And I just want to, I'm praying for you and praying for Stand to Reason, but really just thank you for this conversation. I'm almost certain it's going to impact somebody.
Yes. Well, thank you for what you're doing. You're part of the Stand to Reason family too, my friend.
I appreciate it. I think I have all of Greg's books, so maybe that grants me access into the family.
You're leading, so you're doing it.
Leading, right. That's true. Apos director, only one in Delaware. I take pride in that. Well, thank you so much, Megan. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in, and God bless.